Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Hilke Schellmann, who is a professor of journalism at New York University and also the author of this book here called The Algorithm: How AI Decides Who Gets Hired, Monitored, Promoted, and Fired, and Why We Need to Fight Back Now. Welcome, Hilke.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a field that I've been interested in for many years. I taught a course on HR analytics for a couple of years. And the future of work. I have a couple friends who did startups in this space. And, it's what we're seeing is the incorporation of various machine learning techniques into the entire HR process, right?
Yes.
From finding employees to, hiring them. And then, of course, you talk about this as well, performance evaluation, promotion, termination, firing.
And even succession planning, right? Like we can use, and I think that might be actually a good use case for machine learning to use it to sort of understand here are the skills that we need. How can we plan for the future? Not only like individual successions, but like sort of like, what does the future of work hold? What kind of people do we need? So I think HR analytics can be really helpful in some use cases.
Well, in a way, the HR folks are the least sophisticated, I think, within the corporate functional areas, right? So marketing has been doing this stuff for years. And then, on the production manufacturing side, typically the folks that you meet in HR, they're not terribly sophisticated technically. And so part of what I've been doing for all these years is trying to get them on board, right? With, using more software, using more tools, focusing on more data. But perhaps because of the lack of sophistication, this has become an area that is filled with what you call, AI snake oil, or digital snake oil, where these tools, they come with wonderful ad campaigns and marketing campaigns.
Become wonderful, like what's not to love about some of the messaging, right? We have like we have AI vendors come in and say, their tools will democratize hiring because they assess everyone the same way. They're bias free. They're going to pick the most qualified candidates. They're efficient, and they're going to, save companies HR costs and labor costs. And yes, I think they are more efficient, and they are probably save companies money and labor costs. But they're definitely not bias free. In fact, we found, in my research, I found a lot of bias in these tools. We also really haven't found any evidence that they pick the most qualified candidates. In fact, from a survey of C-suite leaders of over 2,000 of them, if their company used an AI tool, almost 90% said that their tool rejects qualified candidates. So they know it doesn't always work, and it doesn't pick the most qualified candidates. So, like we see a lot of big marketing, and my job as an investigative journalist to find like evidence. Is this true? Are the marketing claims true? What kind of evidence do we see when we actually start digging and look at some of the tools? And unfortunately, I would say a lot of the marketing messages are oversimplifying, overselling the power of the tools.
Now, look, we can't evaluate these tools in isolation. We have to compare them to the alternative. And we know that human decision-making in this area is remarkably
absolutely
bad.
Biased. Yes. Humans are terrible at hiring. We're terrible. We're biased. It's very problematic. And I wish I could answer that question for you. Like, is AI more biased or human hiring? And I don't know the answer because I'm connected to a research university. I work with a lot of computer scientists and sociologists, and we do want to do these academic long-term studies, longitudinal studies to actually understand which tools were better. And that would be a huge boost in the public interest to do this kind of work. But I haven't found a company who actually does it. We would love to do this work and sort of really find out like what is better. I think the one concern I have right now with AI tools is like, one human hiring manager can, be biased against a certain amount of people. It's usually very limited. How many can they possibly hire in a year, right? And I'm sorry to all the people who have been, the victim of somebody who's biased in HR or in hiring manager. But the problem is with the AI tool, we sometimes see it used in like a new scope. If you have a resume parser that's discriminating against women, if you use it in all incoming resumes in your company, some companies receive millions, literally millions of applications. So the harm can be just so much larger than one biased human can apply. And I also feel like if we build these sophisticated AI tools, let's make sure they work and they're not, compounding the already bias that people, especially people of color, especially women, especially people with disabilities, have already encountered. Let's make sure this stuff works, right? And we actually like making the world a little bit of a better place than making it a worse place. So I think that's sort of my aim with looking into these tools and finding that often they do more harm than good. So I want us to like build better tools. And I actually want us to go back to human hiring because you're right, like humans are absolutely biased and we try training, we try all kinds of things and we can't get the bias out of the humans. So my idea is like, can we build better machines? Can we build better processes of hiring than we have now? Because I think what has happened in sort of what I call maybe the first generation of AI tools, where we just like sort of digitized or automated already kind of flawed processes that I'm sure every recruiter knows that like a resume isn't super valid in predicting how successful you will be. So why are we using that to reject and put people into the next round, right? Like, is there a way to have like a more well-rounded way of hiring people? I think we really need to have a discussion. And I think HR really needs to have this discussion on talent acquisition right now because we see the amount of applications they get are even like now more staggering, right? Because we see job seekers use ChatGPT to generate cover letters, resumes. Now we have AI Hawk that can apply to open positions in seconds. So you don't even have to do anything as a job seeker. So like now recruiters and folks in TA are complaining that, they get even more volume. Like how are we going to get through that? And how can we still find good candidates?
Yeah, I love how at the end of the book you have some advice on how to make your resume machine readable and so forth. But
I
look,
mean, there's like, so, sometimes we talk about like, news you can use a little bit, that wasn't my aim. But as I was like studying a lot of these tools and talk to vendors, I sort of understood like, okay, I think here are like sort of best practices. It might not work in every case, but probably like to have a basic machine readable resume that adheres to like, these 5 or 6 things that I point out is probably is going to do more good than harm you. And there are some tools that I point people to where you can upload the job description and your resume, and sort of understand how much overlap presumably any kind of out of the box AI tool would give you. And I think that's really helpful because I think a lot of job seekers forget to put some of these like important skills on their resumes, and they might get overlooked even though they might have the skills, especially women who we know sort of in general, not all women, but many, sort of underestimate their qualifications, right? And a lot of men sort of, apply to jobs where they're, maybe just a little bit qualified and maybe they overestimate their skills. And I think, if we can push back a little bit on that, I think that might be helpful.
well, when I teach, I've been teaching a course on data and decisions for over a decade. And when I start that course, I always start with the example of Billy Bean. And of course, he is an HR manager, right? I mean, he's a recruiter, he's a promoter, he's in charge of putting together the team. And it's in this area where he was able to dramatically improve performance. And I think he was able to do this because he had access to some what we might think of as objective performance metrics. Um, but it seems like that promise of improving the quality of the workforce through data science and analytics, that's not always what these systems are about. I mean, a lot of these systems are just about kind of automating the the process that's already in place, right?
Yeah,
And so,
filtering, rejecting. And, I mean, obviously, like if you have AI tools that does like the scheduling for you and like does that, like all like power to you. That is like absolutely a benign way of using AI. Like use AI for spam filters. They're great. Like, use it as an office assistant. It's great. But I'm sort of worrying about like sort of high risk decision making on humans, which I would classify hiring decisions into that. I mean, I know that some companies say, like, well, everyone gets rejected when they're looking for jobs. Yes, true. But I think job seekers assume that they get rejected or ghosted because they're not the most well qualified candidate. And that may not necessarily be true. Not necessarily be true for human hiring, but also not for AI hiring. But I think we could really improve that process because I hope that companies also do want to find the most qualified people. And I'm not sure that's always happening with these tools.
well, what I'm saying is, I mean, one way you could apply these tools is just to, predict who you were going to hire using the traditional process, and then just make that whole thing easier. Now, of course, if the original hiring process was one that was biased or ineffective, then now you've got the same biased, ineffective system, but it was cheaper. And it
Exactly.
seems
And we've
like,
seen this again and again, right? Like
yeah,
Amazon had that problem that they used resumes, maybe of their tech division or so. That's maybe a hypothesis, right? Because they used the resumes of people who are currently in the job to train and a sort of algorithmic tool. And they found out over time that the tool started to downgrade people who had the word women or woman on their resume, right? So because probably there was historic bias in the pile of the resumes, the training data. So if you had hired women over time, then exactly their biases and their preferences would be reflected. So the problem is with like actually like data at work, most of it is kind of like tainted or biased. The same with performance reviews. We know exactly that women and people of color who maybe do the same work as like white counterparts or male counterparts get routinely more negative performance reviews. It's actually really hard to find criteria to sort of understand like what is actually an objective performance review, right? Like, is it because the person likes to have a beer with you, or you are
mhm,
actually like exceeding KPIs? Like, it's a real big question. So if we use kind of this flawed data to build the tools, if we don't push against bias and really check the results, I think we could really have a problem. And we see usually what companies in the US at least do, AI vendors that check for male against females and the different racial categories outlined by the Uniform Guidelines from 1978, so a very long time ago, against the different racial categories. But they don't look actually, for example, white men versus African American females. And we often see on these intersections of the marginalized groups where a lot of the discrimination bias happens. And we actually don't see anything to test for like what is with people with disabilities. We have all kinds of protected classes. We're not looking at that. So I think that's really problematic.
but wait, are you suggesting then that this might actually make your workforce worse, right? Because I mean, or that these the pathologies of hiring will be exacerbated through automation? Because if all we got was the same crappy decision making, but we got it for cheaper, I mean, that would be it wouldn't be worse. It would be
I
a little better, unless we have,
mean,
unless for some reason we put we now believe we put more faith in it. So before we knew it was kind of crappy,
yes.
and now for some reason we think, oh well, it's amazing now, right?
Subjective, it's data science, right? It's like machine learning, like the AI is right, even though, who knows, it might have just found correlations that have nothing to
Mhm.
do, that are actually not causally related, right? Like one of the resume screeners, when I talked to some of the employment lawyers who were brought in, they found out like that the word Thomas was a predictor of success, probably because, the tool probably did a statistical analysis of all the resumes in the pool. And maybe there were some Thomases that were hired. But obviously, that everyone knows that the word Thomas doesn't qualify you for anything. So I think, yes, it obfuscates the decision making, makes it to look neutral or objective or whatever we ascribe to machine learning. And so it can like bring the human bias back in, but it can actually amplify bias. And we see
Yeah.
this in AI systems that because we ask the AI to rank people We don't want, no recruiter wants to have like 1,000 resumes in their inbox, right? If you put like something on LinkedIn, like you want it ranked. That's like the beauty of these algorithmic tools. You want to call the people that are ranked the 21st spots and not all the 1,000. You don't want to do the work yourself. But what we force some AI tools to do is like make a decision who's who's going to be the better employee, or predict that. And we don't actually know how the ranking is working. So I talked to John Jerson, who's the former vice president of product at LinkedIn, who explained like how these like little differences that are actually probably not meaningful in employment or your success in employment, actually, because we push the algorithm to make these decisions, these decisive decisions in the rankings, can actually amplify bias. So there can be machine bias coming into the tools to amplify the problem. So it could make it worse. We always hope it makes it better, but we actually really don't have evidence that it makes it better. And I'm all for evidence. Like I would love to look at companies' pilot studies, if they exist. I would love to see how HR managers sort of talk about these tools, understand these tools, like what assumptions go into it. I think we really need to do much more due diligence on these. And I think if you work with an AI vendor that cannot tell you how a score comes to be and says like, it's a deep neural network, we don't know, it's all in training data, I would be really worried, because we have only seen time and again that we find the bias in these tools and not the opposite. The tool doesn't erase the bias, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, that's the promise, right? The promise of the analytic tools is that they will identify the flaws in the human decision making and then, eliminate them. But this only works if you have access to some kind of ground truth, right? Where you can actually say, oh, here are the false positives, here are the false negatives, and then, go back and recursively improve the decision making. But I mean, this is this is data science 101. Like, if you have a good data science instructor, you on day one, you learn about, well, what exactly is it that you want to have, as your target feature, right?
I would hope that companies would close the loop, right? Like sort of
Yeah.
if you predict that, person A is going to be successful and you hire them, were they successful 3 years down the road, right? Like, can you
Right.
actually update your ATS or, whatever applicant tracking system or whatever system you use to actually understand, was the prediction right? You
Yeah.
would think that. I have not found, I've talked to many CHROs and folks that very high up at big Fortune 500 companies that do not seem to have these kinds of loop systems where like the HR, like the hiring function talks to the employee
Yeah.
function, right? Like the people
Right.
that are then employed and sort of actually like figures out, well, did this work or not? And I don't know why. I wish, because you would hope that companies have this long view, that they want to be around for a long time and they want to hire the best people, that they would have built in a loop. But we haven't seen that. I would love that, and I would love to answer the question, is AI better or human hiring? We should just build better tools. That's like my takeaway, and really like only focus on like skills and capabilities. Like we know what works in hiring. Like, we need to look at skills and capabilities. That is the most predictive. And if I want to hire you for a job, and if I could put you in the job for a month to perform the job, that is actually one of the most predictive things, not really feasible. But can I do assessments that actually go to the heart of the job versus trying to use proxy words on resumes to find ways to sort of understand if you're a good employee? I think the problem is like we assume that AI tools are thinking machines, that they find something that is meaningful. But they have no conscience. They don't understand. They just pick, they do a quantitative analysis. Oh, Thomas is mentioned so many times, so it's relevant. Well, Thomas doesn't mean anything. It's not meaningful for employment, but we sort of try to describe meaning to it, right? Like the first time I encountered like lacrosse as a criterion resume parsers, I was like, well, maybe like the AI tool felt like the magic sauce, that maybe lacrosse is,
Well,
who
humans do
needs
that.
that for the sales position? Like it
Right.
is really helpful if you've played lacrosse in high school. And the person I was talking to was like laughing. He's like, you think like a human. You think there's like reason behind this. There's no reason. It's just a statistical analysis. The tool didn't find anything. And in fact, if you want to argue it's like team sports or something that make you successful in this job, though, why not baseball? Why not basketball? Like lacrosse isn't any different. Like, this makes no sense. It's just a statistical correlation. So I think we as humans over prescribe to machine decisions. In fact, we know this from like social science and studies of like, even when people know where the exit is in an emergency, they follow a robot into a wall because they believe the robot knows and knows better, even though they actually know where the exit is. Like, it is, we fall into that trap as humans all the time. Like, we're like, oh, well, the machine says it must be right.
Yeah, this idea of closing the loop, it's astonishing to me. I mean, I'm at a couple major universities, and sometimes the admissions people operate completely autonomously from like the alumni people and the recruiting people. And so there's no feedback like, hey, you're admitting the wrong people or whatever. There's no attempt to integrate those databases.
And that's like food for thought for me for the next coming years, is like the idea, like, can we actually predict human behavior in such a like varied ways that is employment, right? Like, because it's like, obviously it depends on the skills and capabilities you have, but it also depends on like the team we put you in, how the company itself is doing, right? Nobody really ever looks into that. And we look maybe, oh, we need these skills, but what kind of other assets do we need in the team? If the team is toxic and put the best person in there, they're probably going to quit, or they're not going to be successful. Also the state of the company, but then there's also like so many life decisions that can happen to you that are you can be a caregiver to your kids. Suddenly you have a difficult pregnancy, you have to take care of your parents, you move away, who knows? Like, none of that is kind of predictable in a way. That the question is like, can we actually predict some of
Well,
this, or is it too complex?
that's a open question, and I think that these things are iterative. I know some friends that started a company, and they looked at call center employees, and there's a job which is where the productivity metrics are relatively easy to observe. Yeah, there's flaws, like if you say, oh, this person had more calls, and then you dig deeper and you realize, oh, well, actually the customers were not
Did they solve the
satisfied.
problems, right? Or did they
Yeah.
just get on the phone because
Right. Then you go back and you revise the metric. And then they said, well, maybe it depends on who you're sitting next to. So then they went back and so I mean, you do have these companies have a very strong financial interest in identifying, good employees. And if they're thinking carefully, if they're under economic pressure to do the right thing, they're not going to just accept some random snake oil one would expect, right?
I am as baffled as you. Like when I started looking into HireVue in 2018, which is one of the largest AI video based interviewing companies. They have two things, right? They have like a traditional. It's always traditional now that we have it for like 10 years or so, where you do like, one-way video interview where you just record yourself answering the questions. And sometimes human hiring managers do watch these videos, bless their hearts, that they do this for hours at a time. But sometimes companies can also, opt in to have an AI tool analyze the video interview and sort of give a score and ranking. So when I started looking into them at the time, that company was still using emotion expression analysis,
Mhm.
sort of understanding what facial expressions do I use answering question, and compare it to other people who did the same video interview are now employed. And if they presumably smiled or frowned answering the same questions, what are their strengths and weaknesses, or whatever the question was, they would get points for that, or more or less points. But when I started digging deeper, it turns out like there is no research looking at like what facial expressions in job interviews predict how successful we're going to be. That doesn't exist. That's not a thing. And when I started looking, there's this other thing that effective computing companies say, is that we all have the same six emotions. That when I smile, I'm happy. If I frown, I'm angry. And that might be true for a lot of people in the same cultural circle, but it's certainly not ubiquitous for all people in the world. It's actually very culturally dependent, and psychology has actually changed the consensus here over years and feels like there's much more variability. So, but these companies were using this, and large Fortune 500 companies were using this without any kind of scientific backing, because I think the idea is like, it just sounds true. Like, my facial expressions, the words that I use, what I write, it seems like my personality's in that, my capabilities shine through somehow. But is that really true? But it sounds true. So we want to believe it. And I think a lot of Fortune 500 companies, they get so many applications that they just need a way to cull through it and
You
reject
could
people
you
and
could
have
use a
like a
you could
manageable
use a
amount.
random you could use a random number generator. I mean,
That's what
it's
people have
cheaper.
suggested. That is for free. But for some reason, like we have this thing as humans, like we want to create meaning, maybe in a somewhat uncontrollable situation where we are faced with thousands of applicants. It's really hard to tell who out of these resumes is really the most or one of the most qualified people. Because, if you put it in a job description that you need to know the programming language Python, like I'm sure 99.99% of candidates put that on their resume. Do I know how good they are? No, I don't. So I think that's sort of the problem. It's like we can't really know, but we want to control the process and bring meaning to it. So I think we believe these tools, and I think there is a little bit of awakening in HR that some of these tools really did not work. And I've talked to a lot of chief people officers who told me, "Oh yeah, we did that video game company. We used that for a few years. We really the marketing was so great. It sounded great that you can just pump up balloons, and we will find out how good you will be at this job." Not thinking through like how the tools were conceived and what is missing or lacking. And they sort of quietly stopped using it. And I was like, I mean, I'm very glad you're not using it anymore. It's really good because we have no evidence that the tool works and that it doesn't discriminate. So two things. But the problem is like the public doesn't know. The next talent acquisition company doesn't know that or team. So they're going to like listen to the same amazing marketing and they're going to use the tool. So we need to have like much more transparency. But I understand that it's difficult for companies who use the technology. It's like a reputational damage if, like the public finds out that they use kind of flawed tools. And I think they're also afraid of lawsuits that like, if it comes out that the tool discriminated against women, I mean, there might be a lot of women who apply to the company who are going to, start a class action lawsuit. So I think there is possibly that companies could be damaged. But I wonder if we can change that somehow, that we can have a more honest, open public discourse about some of these tools that work or don't work.
Well, when you say work and don't work, I mean, sometimes these things will work in ways that we don't understand. So one of the criteria that my friends, their HR company, identified as a predictor of successful and productive employees was what browser they used to apply for the job. So apparently, this had a very strong correlation with productivity and time on the job and so forth. And when I asked them, well, why is that? They said, well, we have no idea. We don't know. We don't care. Like it works. So let's use it. Right.
I
So,
mean, sure, you can say
yeah.
that, but is that a causal reality, or is this actually something that tells you probably more about the socioeconomic background of people? That there's sometimes this thing like, well, if you use an Apple browser or an Apple phone, like you do this and this, and I'm like, well, probably because the explanation might be that it's not predictive if you're going to be successful in the job. It probably predicts that you're from a higher socioeconomic background, you have more money, so you can afford an Apple phone, and you have more knowledge and maybe more education, right? Like those kinds of
Yeah.
things might be
There's
at
nothing
play.
wrong
Like,
with
why
that.
don't you just pay for because the opposite is probably not true. So, meaning if you use a browser and that is predictive of you being successful as an accountant and making this up, well, then just try browsers and people. Do they become good accountants? I
Yeah.
doubt it, that has anything to do with each other. And what is with the person who's a good accountant who just happens to like Safari and they don't like Safari? I mean, you put out people, it's the same thing. I think somebody found out that like certain software developers, if they like manga comics, that is a predictor of success. Yes, probably it's a correlation for a certain group, but should you then look for manga comics on resumes? First of all, lots of people wouldn't put it on there. So you're already singling them out. What is with like maybe a single female mother who has no time for manga comics or isn't interested, but is a kick-ass programmer? You're just like hiring the same people again and again, and you're using a correlation that is not actually a causation. Just look for the capabilities. Why would you go through a proxy of a browser that is like totally uncertain? Look for the skills that you need for the job, instead of
Well, but
like,
hold on.
yeah.
I mean, look, if it works, it works. I mean, if people who wear green shirts do better than people who wear red shirts, and you hire people with green shirts and you improve productivity, like, so what? Like, why would you
Well,
care?
but what if the green shirts are all men, and it's because you hired more men in the
Who
past
cares?
and they were all green shirts? That
No, it
is,
has nothing to do with what you hired in the past. Like, if you actually have a good metric of productivity or value that is a ground truth, right? That's not okay, they got promoted or got good performance evaluations. But if you actually had a good, metric, right? And it does correlate with some of these other characteristics that you're uncomfortable with. Why would that be a problem?
I mean, it is kind of a problem because you don't know if it's like causally related. It could just be random, a random correlation that happens in data science all the time. Like, if you would look at, videos in job interviews, and you would look at people who are currently in the job, you might find out that people with brown hair seem to be very successful with your company because predominantly people with brown hair, there are more people with brown hair than red hair or blonde hair. So is that then fair that we only hire people with brown hair? Obviously, it's a correlation, but it's not a causation. So this can happen all the time. It's the same with like if you hire basketball players, if you want to find basketball players, well, statistically, they all have largest shoe sizes because they're often taller than the average man. But should you hire people based on shoe sizes for your basketball team? I mean, I don't think that's a good idea because even the bad basketball players have probably bigger shoe sizes. So I think it's just not, if you have no ground truth, if you have no proven causation, I would stay away from it because it's not proven that it works. And you might actually find something about socioeconomic background than other things. Like, it is correlated. Like we know that the longer the distance is to work, the faster people quit. Probably because their commute is unbearable. But that could actually cause, people, especially people, we live in a country that has a history of redlining. A lot of people live in segregated neighborhoods. So maybe people with the longer commutes are predominantly African American. You might discriminate against them, even though it's perfectly, it's even a causal effect. But that doesn't make it right to do that. And it might not be a criteria how good of a well-qualified candidate you are. And you want to hire the people, I would assume you want to hire the people with the best skills and capabilities and not the same people that you already have. And I think that's the problem with like correlations. But we see this also with like, the famous example is like, if you look at the graph of like ice cream sales and murders, they go exponentially up in the summer. So that's a correlation. The graph looks exactly the same way. So should we ban ice cream sales in the summer and then the murder rate goes down? Obviously not. It's actually not connected. What is the connective tissue or this, the causing denominator is summer. Should we ban summer? So I think that's sort of the problem. There's a lot of correlations, but might not causally actually be meaningful.
Right. And you point out that some of these folks, what they're doing is they are looking at the characteristics of their current employees, and then they are seeking to recruit people that have those characteristics. But that's
Yeah, and
different
I think they
from,
actually start with wanting to
yeah.
diversify their workforce, which I think a lot of people want to do, right? They sort of realize, well, there is, we talked about there's so much bias in human hiring, and until like a few years ago, humans have hired traditionally people. So we assume that we have fewer women in leadership position, fewer people of colors, fewer people with disabilities. It's probably because of human bias, because we underestimated those people for a very long time. So now we have that in our current workforce. So if I use that data to hire my new crop of people, I'm not understanding how you get rid of the sort of that you have more male employees in their preferences in the way they phrase things or something like that in resumes or cover letters. You can get out of that unless you have like a algorithmic function that pushes against it. So, we've seen there's a couple of companies that did some analysis in job descriptions that if you say like, I don't know, aggressive and like, I don't know, like rock star, that fewer women will apply because that is like very male, more aggressive language. So if you have that in cover letters that you then use to train algorithms, you might then reject cover letters from predominantly women because they use less, on average, less aggressive language. So I think we have like really good intentions, but I think data science, machine learning is very complex and needs a lot of testing of the results, and that takes time and expertise, and and I'm not seeing that companies put in those that kind of human oversight or human testing. They need something out of the box. They want something that works, that makes their life easier, and it makes their life more efficient. But I think we don't understand how much oversight you have to build into the system because they trust the vendors. But oversight is expensive.
But look, I mean, this idea of just replicating what you currently have, I mean, that's different from you hire a wide range of people, and then within that wide range of people, you notice differences and you notice correlations in those differences, and then you go and you try to recruit a batch of people that have the characteristics that correlate with your high performers. I mean, assuming that the high performance is in fact related to output and productivity, that's and you don't need to have a scientific theory as to why those correlations matter. Do
I
you? I
mean, I
mean,
kind
it's
of disagree
nice.
that, like, in high risk, I mean, I'm happy to like have that argument. It's like I'm just afraid that we see this again and again, that we look at correlations and then they turn out to be not a correlation of being successful, but a correlation about socioeconomic background. So, for example, I think a lot of humans, and I think, if you use a pile of resumes of people you've hired in the past, and maybe you hired for elite colleges before, you thought people from have a degree from Harvard and
Yeah.
Stanford are smart, and you would definitely give them a chance. And so you hire more of those. So any tool that you
Okay.
build will now assume that, because statistically those schools are overrepresented. So then you might, the tool might find a correlation that, like, yeah, people from Harvard who went to Harvard and Stanford, they're more successful here. But we know from social science that, like, going to Harvard or any elite college doesn't actually tell us anything about your intelligence. It tells us everything about your socioeconomic background, because that makes the difference.
Yeah, but it seems like there's a difference between a discriminative process, which is ultimately what we're doing. I mean, whenever you take a million applicants and you boil it down to 1,000 jobs, I mean, you're doing some kind of statistical discrimination. And there's the discrimination that works, and then there's the discrimination that doesn't work, right? That's based on and so I think you're saying that you have a problem with discrimination that works if it works for reasons that have disparate outcomes, as well as
Yes.
ones.
And that
Yeah.
have nothing to do with the job, that just has anything to do with, like, your parents' background, which I think is something we don't want to do in hiring, right? We want to have a merit-based hiring system that doesn't discriminate. We don't want to replicate privilege.
Well, look,
And
I
in
mean,
this case, I would argue we might unintentionally, I'm not saying this is intentionally, right? Like, that's sort of the problem. Like, we do these things unintentional, but they might have the same effects. That they unintentionally now replicate privilege, which we didn't want to do. But in our data, we have this problem built in.
well, I mean, if we discover that people who we hire who have engineering degrees do better than people who have no engineering degrees, I mean, we're going to ultimately hire people who come from higher income, right? I mean, that's
I mean,
because there's a
if
strong
and I'm
correlation,
not
right?
saying you shouldn't hiring people for engineering degrees if it's an engineering job. Um, But does engineering degrees have anything to do with, like, if it's like a cafeteria position? I doubt it. You want to hire people with engineering degrees, even though the data tells you that those are more success. I mean, like, I think there's something to, like, really look at, like, and I think that's the problem that we don't do. Is, like, we don't really we don't do a job analysis where we actually figure out what are the skills and capabilities that you need, not what we assume you need for this
Yeah.
position. And I think we also see this again and again, that people, like, job descriptions, you have a job description that worked 5 years ago. You hired somebody, they're now leaving. you pull out this old job description and then you add 5 new things to that old job description that you want this new person to have because, obviously things have evolved. You want them to know more technical skills or new tools or whatever it is. So then you create this laundry list of things that these candidates have to have that no unicorn exists who has all of these criteria, right? There's Joe Fuller, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, who looked at I think it was uh, uh, um, people who work in cashiers, that there are 31 skills that companies on average want them to have. It's wild. It's probably because you add to the job description. So you come up with this but are they really meaningful? I doubt it. It's just that we added them over time, or a tool may have pulled them out that you need this, but do you really? So I think we have on all fronts more work to do. And I'm not against using correlation. You just have to show that it's causally connected and that it doesn't discriminate, that you not accidentally find a proxy that feels like it's predictive, but it's actually telling you something else about people, that more men look at manga comics, and that then you're hiring more men. It's probably more to do with them being men than being computer scientists or something like that, right? So I think we really need to be careful about that.
Well, let's dig into some of the pseudoscience that is behind some of these
Oh yeah.
tools. You mentioned, phrenology, right? As, being used actually. I don't know. Did job applicants get their heads measured back in the day? Maybe.
I mean, it's sort of it's sort of the idea that in our facial expressions or in our body, there's cues to our inner self, right? To
Yeah.
our skills and capabilities, who we are. And, I think the maybe most famous example is the idea of our handwriting. It does look very unique, right? Everyone
Graphology.
does have graphology that has been
Big
used
in
in
France.
hiring. And yes, for decades, until a few decades ago, there's never been one scientific study that could prove that your personality and your skills and capabilities are in your handwriting, that this is actually a science that can be replicated. Sure, someone can say oh, looking at the way you write your B, you are extrovert. I don't know. Whatever it is. But it feels intuitively right? This is our individual handwriting. Of course, there must be meaning in it. So we should use it. And I think that's the same sort of problem that we've seen with the facial expression analysis. Yes, we have facial expression and they seem to be meaningful. When I look at my child and smile at them, I hope they feel my love, right? For them, I hope it's meaningful. But it doesn't actually have any meaning in job context, especially not in job interviews that sort of are predicting job performance, right? It's another layer there of distance. I'm talking about myself, not actually performing the job. So I think those are sort of the things that we trap into again and again. The idea that a couple of companies put this forward that I tested, that our personality is in our LinkedIn resumes, or the stuff that we put in our LinkedIn profile, and in our Twitter feeds, or X as it's now called. Seems intuitive. Some of the stuff I like, and I sort of wonder, well, if I like a post, is I really saying something about me? But the stuff that I've written, maybe that does reflect who I am deep down, seems right. But when we tested those tools, I tested it first with a psychologist who's really loves AI, and he got sadder and sadder. So we did the examples because it turns out we both have multiple personalities. Because at one point I was extroverted and I was introverted with the same tool. So either I really have a problem, or these tools don't work. And then we did a larger study with a sociologist and computer scientist and a psychologist, and we actually did find out that these AI tools, the two ones that we tested, do not work in predicting what your personality is based on your LinkedIn feed and on your Twitter. So I'm not saying it doesn't work at all, but in these two instances, it really didn't work. So I think we have to be really cautious to say that there is us in there. We might fall into the same trap that scientists 150 years fell into, that that they can find the face of the criminal by overlaying photos. And we've seen this in science too. We've seen scientists put like photos of people who are gay and identify as heterosexual over each other and say like, now they found a gay face. Like that's not good science either. So I'm not saying it's only like data science or applied science that is a problem. We humans fall into a lot of traps like these. So I think there's a whole, and I'm worried that we see this seen again and again. And sometimes, like Higher View, thank God, stopped using the facial expression analysis in their tool. But then there are other companies that then use it again. So I feel like, no, we just showed that it doesn't work. Let's not use it again. In fact, it will be a little bit harder to use because it's now been outlawed in the European Union. So any company that operates there is not allowed to use it. So maybe that will trickle down into the US. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I always thought that the graphology that they used in France was sort of it was a way to find out like who went to which school, right? Because you could figure out like, oh, they went to the Catholic school because they had the nuns, teaching them
That's
to
how they
write.
do the L
Right?
and like, yeah.
Right? That's what I always thought. But look, are we upset by this? Do we get a bad feeling about this, like these personality profilers, because they work or because they don't work? If we think about Cambridge Analytica, if Cambridge Analytica was not good at capturing our personalities, then why would we care? Then it's just it's just random. If they're just sending out random ads, oh, we think you're going to love this because we think you're somebody who's needs control or you're somebody who's neurotic, and it's like, no, I'm not. Like, then we wouldn't get
Yeah,
upset.
and you know what? Like in marketing and like selling things, they're lost if they categorize me wrong and like sent me an ad and I don't care about the ad
Right.
at all. I don't. But I do think like hiring is a little different. The stakes are a little higher for the job seeker, right? It like matters if I have a job and I get a salary and can feed my child and put a roof over my head. Like, so it does matter how companies find employees.
Yes, but are we upset because it does figure out our personality, or are we upset because it fails to figure out our personality?
There's a couple of things, right? Like those AI tools that we tested said they're based on DISC and Big Five. So it turns out they may be based on that, but when we tested them against traditional Big Five assessment and DISC, they're actually not. They didn't have the same LinkedIn, and when we tested this on like a much larger sample, it actually didn't find the same personality prediction. That's the idea, right? That we have the same personality that rarely change, certainly not within 5 minutes of an AI analysis, and so that it's predictive. But what I would also say is DISC themselves on their website say, do not use this for employment decisions. This is not a tool or a test calibrated for that. So I think the Big Five probably has been checked and is validated, but we also know that so personality tests, they may work great, but we also know that they have very little validity for hiring decisions, meaning your personality on a good day maybe predicts 10% of your job performance, usually much, much lower. So why are we using a criterion that is so low on the prediction scale? We're using it because because in the US, it produces very much less disparate impact, meaning people of different races, women and men, sort of have similar outcomes. We don't see a lot of discrimination there, which are different to IQ tests and other tests that produce a big disparate impact. So we don't use it. But is it valid to use in the job context? Not really. It's very low validity. So why are we using it? Because we need to use something, I think is my take on some companies, that they feel like we need to use something. And you know what? The 2% validity is better than none. But that is really in question. Like because a personality prediction uses something that's static. So like, it might be that a personality prediction is right about me, that I'm like, that I'm conscientious and, what are the other things, but it might also be that I can overcome that in my job, right? Like my personality might be that I'm neurotic, but maybe I've learned to like calm myself at work and like have like processes that work. It doesn't account for that. It takes a snapshot of something that actually doesn't account that we as humans can actually overcome that and understand like, oh, I don't like public speaking. I don't like to be out there, but I can train myself to do this and overcome it. A personality prediction wouldn't actually find that, right? It would find that I don't like public speaking or whatever it is, what my preferences are, but it wouldn't understand that, oh, actually, she trained herself. She has overcome that. And I think that's some of the reason why I think it's like not a great tool. If you
Mhm.
use it, you should use it with a plethora of other tools. Don't use it as the one criterion.
Yeah, so there's two possible problems. One is that these tools don't actually measure the thing that they're purporting to measure, like
Yeah.
your big five personality profile. The other problem is that even if it does identify it accurately, that feature doesn't actually predict the performance that is the real reason why you're using the tool.
Oh, thank you for summarizing it. That took me way
Yeah,
longer to get. You're right. That's exactly what I
right.
was trying to say.
But still, I mean, if I think about like, for instance, the so-called gaydar classifier, people were very upset with that. But I couldn't figure out, like, are they upset because it's accurate or because it's inaccurate, right? Because most people want other people to know, right? They actually act in ways that are intended to convey their sexual preference. And so if
I
it if
mean,
it
I think the
if it's
interesting thing about that study is like, people were upset and criticized it because they felt like, well, this could also be used by like dictatorships that outlaw homosexuality to now
yeah,
find people who are possibly homosexual and without even a positive ground truth, right? We don't actually know if the person, if your face gets flagged as homosexual, you're actually homosexual.
yeah,
Like it presumes something about your identity that's not. How would that change in your facial features? Like
sure,
maybe based on a society that we have like pushed like maybe gay men over decades into like a corner and they found ways to like express themselves. But the way like what's kind of interesting, if you read that study, there's like an idea that because some gay men are more susceptible to like female hormones in the womb, that they have these facial expressions that are then in the photos. That is like, I mean, a wild hypothesis that has never been proven by science because you kind of have to explain, right? If you have these two different faces that you found by
mhm,
overlaying all these faces, like where's that coming from? What's the explanation? And the explanation has nothing to do with science. So I think you have the same thing. Yes, you overlaid a lot of photos of people who self-identified as either gay, lesbian, or straight in like a dating app. But does that actually is a ground truth that this is the gay phase and this is the heterosexual
mhm,
phase? It's just like a snapshot of these people that self-identify. We don't actually know what would be the mechanism
mhm,
for this to happen, and if it's actually truthful. And in fact, it can be very dangerous in an application. It could like, I don't know. I see like maybe some parents who would look at like send their photo of their kid through one of these tools and be like, hey, is my kid gay? I'm going to send them to a psychologist. I'm really worried they have a gay face.
yeah,
And it's like these are difficult things. We try to find things in our outer expression,
uh-huh.
but are they really meaningful? Do they
Yeah, but I
really
mean,
mean anything?
the point is that in those societies where people have intolerance, I mean, they are doing that, right? They're just doing it with you know, their their brain. Every time they look at somebody, they're making an assessment. And so the problem is not with the tool. The problem is that, people are making these assessments for bad reasons, right?
Sure, but is the tool really meaningful, or is it just a snapshot that it works for like Tinder or whatever tool it was
Yeah.
calibrated upon, right? Like, does it really work for other societies where people have, different facial
Yeah.
expressions, like,
Out of
and
sample. Yeah.
it could just be overgeneralizing for this one
Yeah.
uh, demographic, or this one sliver of people who self-identified themselves on Tinder. It doesn't. There's also people who like change the sexual preference. Like, how is their facial expression changed? Like, they did a piece for the Wall Street Journal about an AI vendor in Israel who said, based on people's facial expressions, the tool can predict if you're a pedophile or a terrorist. Or you can be a terrorist and pedophile together. Same idea. I can predict if you're
Mhm.
gay or not, but it
Mm.
turns out, like, first of all, like terrorism is kind of a category that might change. So does sexual identity, honestly. For some people, it can change. For some people, they know from birth, or some people repress it. Like, there are all kinds of reasons, right? But like, some people are freedom fighters and some people we call terrorists. It's a political crime. Are they born as terrorists, really? And you can see that in their facial expressions. It was probably trained on a bunch of photos of terrorists, and then every new photo was looked at against it. But is there really a face of terrorists? I doubt it. And some people, like Nelson Mandela, he used to be a terrorist in the eyes of the United States government. Then he became a freedom fighter. So what is he? What is his face going to tell us, right? Like, I think these are really categories that have nothing to do with the way we look, but we assume they're somewhere in there and we're expressing them. So I think it can be really difficult. Like, this AI vendor was like, oh yeah, we should have these cameras at like playgrounds. And if men come around that they identify them as pedophiles, like we should call the police. And I was like, based on their facial expressions, they haven't even done anything. They just walk on the sidewalk. So I think those are, and we don't know what is the face of a pedophile. Like, I think in colloquial language, we sometimes say this, right? Like, this person looks like a criminal or something. We have these assumptions built into it, but they're not true. No one has ever found the face of a criminal. So I think those are difficult things that when you push a little bit and think about it, I think these categories get much less rigid and clear than they seem to be in the machine learning tools. And I do think you're putting on something. I do want to know, actually, if this idea that our innermost personality, like kind of like Cambridge Analytica proposes, or that kind of research around Cambridge Analytica proposes, is actually true. Is our personality in that? Like, I don't know if we have like an actual positive ground truth evidence there. I think it's really interesting to look into that.
Well, my favorite example from the book is when you actually, because you've test driven a lot of these tools, and
yes,
and in one of them you were they were measuring your tone of voice, I think, and you spoke in German.
Yes, so it was a couple of tools. Like, one of them was like checking my ability to speak English, and I spoke German to it, and I got a 6 out of 9 English competent when I wasn't even speaking a word of English. And the other tool was like checking the words that I use. It also actually gave me a personality reading. And it was checking the intonation of my voice. And when I spoke to it in German, I got a transcript of gibberish because it tried to make sense of the words that I spoke in German. I was actually reading the Wikipedia article on psychometrics. So I wasn't even answering any questions about jobs and my strengths and weaknesses. So it made this transcription as total gibberish, but it gave me a 70% match for the job. And it gave me like an analysis of my personality. And I did that test so many times in different ways. And I had so many different personalities again. And like the IO psychologists, I always go back before we publish. We always go back to the makers and talk to them. And, maybe we made a mistake doing the analysis. Like, we want to really engage with people and also give them the chance to comment, to say how they built the tool. And the IO psychologists said, like, well, people between 2 and 8, like the muddy middle, they're all kind of the same. And I was like, really? So I talked to other IO psychologists, and they're like, no, like, if you're in the middle and a few percentage points off, sure, but not on the opposite ends of the personality spectrum almost. Like, those people are not the same. This is like, this is not how the Big Five works. It was a Big Five analysis that they said they would pull out of my voice and the words that I use. So, again, what you said, we don't know if it's actually saying what it analyzes. Sorry, Greg, I have a meeting at 1:30.
Okay.
We're a little bit over. Can we? Yeah.
Right. One last.
Give me one second.
Question. Yeah.
Last question, Laura. Give me 1 second.
Yeah. In Berkeley, we do everything 10 minutes late. So, okay.
Oh, I wish I could.
Yeah. All right. So look, I mean, what can these HR folks do? I mean, what's the solution? If you're going to buy some kind of piece of physical equipment, you're probably going to insist on some proof that this stuff is going to actually work. But it seems like these procurement people in HR, they don't really insist on evidence to support the efficacy of these tools. What do
Yeah,
we
I
need to?
think I
Do
think
they need to become more educated as consumers, or do we need some kind of consumer
absolutely.
reports, right, for this?
I mean, look, I would love to have a consumer reports, but in the absence of that for AI tools, I think we need to get a whole lot more skeptical and do like pilot studies. Also, like really hire maybe an outside IO psychologist to like take apart the technical report. And if an AI vendor doesn't have a technical report that sort of explains how the tool was validated and built and how they did, at least the 4/5 rule analysis to understand like that there's no disparate impact. If they don't have a technical tool that explains any of that or technical report or whatever they call it, I would assume they didn't do this. And I would run away if they can't even tell you this, how the tool was validated and checked for disparate impact. And then I would really scrutinize these technical reports. And I had people help me with that. And they found a flaws in a couple of technical reports that I was able to get my hands on. So I would do that. Then I would ask really tough questions on like the training data. If they only have a holdout data set on the original training data, they should have a high 90% or so accuracy because it's the same data set that they trained their model on. If that doesn't have a high accuracy, that's already problematic. But was it tested with like data in the wild, third-party data, any other outside auditing? I would want to see that. And I want to see like how they check the algorithms over time. And I think the best bet is to do like a pilot study that doesn't rely on their data scientists, but your own to oversee this and really check and then use the tool, but only then. And also you have to, unfortunately, also monitor it over time because we see sometimes pilot studies work and then over time, the algorithm, like, I don't know, it starts discriminating. So you have to also oversee it over time or do the testing again 6 months later or something like that. So unfortunately, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's clear that I think folks in HR need to upskill in the area of data science so they can evaluate these tools in a more effective way and not
Yeah.
succumb to the digital snake oil. Thanks so much, Hilke, for joining me. The book is called The Algorithm: How AI Decides All This Stuff, Hiring, Firing, and Everything Else. Thanks so
Awesome.
much.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for the tough questions. I appreciate it. I love to talk more about this. So, I love to learn about this. So thank you.
We'll do it again.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.